We're in Matthew chapter 5 this morning. We're concluding our series on blessed, looking at the Beatitudes. And we focus this morning on the final two of the 8. But for the sake of our remembrance and study and catching everybody up, I do see some new faces this morning. I want to go back and start in verse number 1 of chapter 5 and read through verse number 12. The Bible says, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. For those of you that have kind of followed along this series, it's really starting at the beginning. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. One of the things that we emphasized through that series was that this seemed to be a gradual progression of the believer. From the moment they hear that they have no spiritual value of themselves to contribute to the kingdom, that we are spiritually and morally bankrupt, we come to that place where we realize we are poor in spirit. We find ourselves really at the dust before God. And that this progression through these Beatitudes, again, is not just some characteristics that God is pulling out of the skies and out of the heavens and out of a lexicon to try to lay them down here and say, this is what I want believers to look like. I believe what he is saying is this is how we progress and grow, and these are the blessings that are attached to that. For those of you that have not been here, the word blessed that Jesus is using is the Greek word makarios, and it means happy, and he's teaching us what true happiness is like, and people are seeking and searching for happiness in life, and Jesus has outlined it in these Beatitudes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. But for this morning, I want us to focus on these last two. He says, Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. In two instances, among others, Romans chapter 15 and Hebrews chapter 13, God is referred to as the God of peace. Now, if you think about it, when he's saying, Blessed are the peacemakers, he's saying, blessed are those people, not who love peace, not who keep peace. He doesn't say, blessed are the peace lovers. He's not saying, blessed are the peacekeepers. He's saying, blessed are the peacemakers. And if you think about it, what he's saying here is that if God is identified as this God of peace, if the gospel is centered around the fact that we were enemies with God, and God, out of his great love for us, came down and made the relationship and reconciles us who were enemies of him to himself through Jesus Christ. I mean, the gospel is literally the gospel of peace, coming from the God of peace, utilizing the very Prince of Peace to make it happen. So when you think about it, what God is suggesting, what God is teaching, what God is outlining for us in this beatitude is that us as followers of Christ ought to be able to exhibit the same nature of peacemaking that he demonstrated through sending his son to the world. And when we ask ourselves, what is it? What does it mean? We know what a lack of peace is, right? I mean, we live in a troubled world. Well, you may be involved in a troubled relationship. You know what strife is. You know what discontent in relationships are. You know what turmoil is. And you know as well as anybody else that as we live in this world down here, there are going to be conflicts between people. And what Jesus is saying and what he is expecting of his people is that we would be fitted to be agents of peace in this world. If you want to think about what does it mean, we literally become the mediators in conflict. Now, there may be outside conflicts that don't have us involved in them. And we may, as peacemakers, not peacekeepers, not peace lovers, but peacemakers, we may be called on by God to interject ourselves into fractured relationships in an attempt to reconcile them together. Now, there's also another illustration. Not just us as being mediators on the outside of a conflict, stepping into it. We also may have conflict with other people. We're probably going to have conflict with other people, even Christians, including Christians. Maybe some would say especially Christians. I don't know. But we're going to have conflict with one another. So how does this play out in this story? What does that mean for me if I'm having conflict with another believer? What does it mean for me to be able to be a peacemaker in that situation? I'm going to want to recognize the area of where the conflict is resulting. I have to be able to identify, what is this in my relationship with this believer that is causing this fractured relationship? Now, it's important to know that there are spiritual components, there are relational components, and there may, in a church context, be theological disagreements. Now, when I'm talking about being a peacemaker, when Jesus is talking about being a peacemaker, when we flesh this out in our life, that does not mean if somebody believes something different than we do, if somebody has a different interpretation of truth, that does not mean that we relent and give up and say, okay, you're right. We don't make peace at the expense of truth. We continue to hold on to that, but how do we then become a peacemaker? We agree to disagree. You can disagree and still not be disagreeable in your relationships with other people. Again, let me restate this. I'm not saying that we become peacemakers at the expense of denying truth. You can hold on to the truth, even if you have a theological disagreement with somebody, and you can still be at peace in the sense that you are agreeing to disagree on that statement, on that belief. But as it comes to the other relational issues, we should strive to want to interject peace, to have reconciliation, to restore. Anybody that has been in the ministry for very long will tell you this is common in churches. It's common for churches to sometimes have theological differences or believers within churches. It's common for people within churches to not see polity all the same way or the direction of the church. And honestly, there may be people that just don't like your attitude or my attitude. That happens. But as believers, as this person is, we're seeing him grow and develop. He is poor in spirit. He is mourning. He is meek. He is hungering and thirsting for righteousness. He now steps out of his prayer closet out into the world. The first 4 represented his relationship to God. The last 4 represent his relationship to other people. He steps out. What is he doing? He is manifestation of mercy. He is being merciful. He is being pure in heart. He is now being a peacemaker. His heart is one that he wants to reconcile. He wants to join what the enemy has torn apart. He wants to find common ground. He wants to bring together. That's his heart. Why would it be his heart? I believe it's this guy's heart. It's his desire to want to be a peacemaker because he remembers that moment face down on the floor. He remembers that moment when he was burdened by the weight of his sin, realizing that he had separated himself from God and was an enemy of God. And he has been moved and has been filled with the truth of the gospel that God, knowing he's an enemy, even while he was an enemy, sent Jesus to die on the cross for him. He has experienced reconciliation. He has experienced peacemaking in its most purest form. God, the offended party, initiating a relationship with man, his enemy, and being willing to forgive and forget all of the sins through the death of his own son. This man gets up and realizes, it's not about me. I want you to think about something, is that when we look at what it looks like, we are tempted, oftentimes when there's conflict, our natural nature is one of retaliation. If someone is in disagreement with me, well, then I'm going to disagree with them. If somebody says something about me, I'm going to say something about them. Our natural nature is to retaliate and to defend ourselves in this relationship. Do you know why we do that? Because we want to be right. Somebody doesn't agree with me, I can find every reason to disagree with them. I can find every reason, I can make every reason to justify my stance. Why do I feel it necessary to justify my stance? Why do I feel it necessary to bow up, to clench my fists, to grind my teeth, to plot my attack? Why? It all comes back to me. I feel I need to justify myself. I feel I need to protect myself. Why? Because to me, I matter. As a believer, in this context, I willingly give up the right to be right in a relationship context. Why should I not approach, if there's conflict, I ought to be willing to recognize the source of the conflict, to own what needs to be owned, but to realize that over all other things, the greatest overarching issue that is here right now is the relationship between two people, not how I view myself, not how I identify myself, not to build myself up, not to lift myself up, not to justify myself, but to realize that even beyond myself, greater than myself, is the significance and the importance of reconciling that relationship at any cost. Even to the point that I'm willing to sacrifice my right to be right in the situation. Again, I'm not talking about diminishing the truth. I'm not talking about letting go of what we believe to be true in a theological sense. I'm talking about as it relates to relationships and the conflicts thereof. That we ought to be able to say, you know what? The greatest element in this situation is my relationship with this person. And I want, as much as possible, Scripture says, as much as is possible with us, we live peaceably with all men. Scripture reminds us we have a duty and an obligation to live at peace, even to the extent of sacrificing our own identity of who we are. Why are they blessed? Number 3, or C, why are they blessed? Why are they happy? It's understood when Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. It's understood that we're going to be thrust into situations where there's going to be conflict. He wouldn't say, blessed are the peacemakers, if there weren't already trials and conflicts and challenges and disagreements and such. But why he says we're happy is this. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Their actions, our actions, this is huge to me. Their actions in advancing peace and seeking peace over their own justification appears to be, through these Beatitudes, a capstone on the believer. This person who is genuinely a peacemaker, this person who recognizes conflict and seeks to reconcile it with Christ, through Christ, using the example of Christ, utilizing the words of Christ, using the power of Christ, even at the expense of themselves. This person that goes in and is genuinely a peacemaker, they will be recognized as a son of God. Now we know that this guy became a son of God the moment he was saved. You can say back at the very beginning, blessed are the poor in spirit. When he realized he was spiritually poverty-stricken and he was saved because of his inability to save himself and trusted in Christ alone, when he became saved, at that moment he became a son of God. From God's perspective, he was a son, born again of the Spirit. But I believe what Jesus is speaking of here is not that we are only saved when we become peacemakers. We don't just become sons of God once we're peacemakers. No, this is not a list of things to accomplish in order to be right with God. This is the result of being right with God. So when this guy comes and he's a peacemaker, even though he is already a son of God, from God's perspective down, everybody else is going to see the relationship and the identity, everybody else in the way we execute peace and the way we seek peace and the way we try to see God's glory manifested through fractured relationships to the point that we're willing to sacrifice our own right to be right, to restore a relationship. Those people are going to say there is an identity between that man or that woman and God. There is a connection. If you do not think this is important, if you do not think that if you think I'm way far off by saying that our ability to make peace, even at our own expense, helps us identify with God, what is the opposite of that? Have you ever seen people that were disagreeable, hateful, always right, cared about themselves more than any other relationship, and it didn't matter if you crossed them for life. They held grudges. They were not interested in reconciliation. Let me ask you a question. Did you ever walk away from an experience with that person and say, man, they are close with God? Did you ever walk away from that experience saying, man, they and God are in step, aren't they? No. Truth be told, you probably walked away from that person and you considered them to be one of your first salvation candidates. I mean, you probably put them on the list of a lost person because of the way they acted. Friends, you know what? There are a lot of people in our community that don't go to church. Some of the reason they don't go to church is because they haven't seen God's people who have experienced the peace of salvation, who have experienced the peace of God demonstrated through the Prince of Peace, through the gospel of peace. They see us not getting along. Why do you think Jesus warned and taught in John chapter 17 that the way others are going to view us and our unity together is going to reveal that Jesus Christ came? How we treat one another gives evidence that we are related to God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. My identity will be evident. I want to say one thing before I close the door on the peacemakers. Why is this person a peacemaker? This isn't on the screen. How did this person get to this place? What I believe in the seventh beatitude, what Jesus does, utilizing they shall be called the sons of God, recognizing their identity among other people as related to God. I believe what Jesus does here is say this. This peacemaking ability is evidence that this person possesses the qualities of the first six. Let me show you how. Think of these first six beatitudes. Look at them in terms of how they relate to peacemaking. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Peacemaking is a recipe that includes poor in spirit, mourning, meekness, hunger and thirst for righteousness, merciful and pure in heart. It is the embodiment, the literal recipe, the cake in the oven of all of the other previous six. So when you and I are evaluating our walk with the Lord and honestly asking God about our progression as a follower of Christ and our level of maturity and growth, I would ask you this. If this is indeed the capstone to reveal that we really have been growing and we really are progressing, how are we? How are we doing in being peacemakers? Husbands, wives, are you being peacemakers in the most important establishment in this world, which is your home? Are you able to put yourself aside, wives, husbands? Are you able to put your own argument aside and at the risk of being right? Are you willing to seek restoration over rightness? in the argument, in the conflict. It's understood that when Jesus said peacemaker, this person wasn't reactive. This person initiated it. This person took the first steps. Husbands, wives, are we needing to take that first step towards our spouse? Are we willing to take that first step in conflict and say, honey, here's the deal. I know why you're upset with me. I know the source of the conflict, and I want you to know that I love you more than being right. I am willing to see this be reconciled all the way through. Do we need to have a conversation about that? Do we need to take that first step? Because friends, if we are not being peacemakers in our home, I doubt that we're being peacemakers anywhere else in the world. The home is the proving ground of our faith. We are never more real than we are in our own home. And maybe that's the first step that needs to be taken. Notice with me, if you would, as we close the door on being a peacemaker, I want you to see what he says next. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The attachment that Jesus gives is the same as the first beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is again showing us the finality. Now, don't get me wrong. The first 7 beatitudes were all descriptive of who we are. But the final one is not who we are. It's what happens to us when we possess the previous 7. It is the result of living that life in the first 7. What Jesus is saying, notice, he doesn't say, blessed are you if you're persecuted. He says, blessed are you when you are persecuted. Blessed are you when it is going to happen. We try to treat persecution as though it's some fine print in the scriptures and surprise when it happens. What does it mean? Jesus gives some very practical examples. He says in verse 11, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you. Let's look at that for a moment on what does it mean. Revile means to verbally attack somebody. It's funny to me how we view persecution in our country, how I view persecution in our country compared to how people in other parts of the world view persecution. I would love to tell you that we view persecution in the United States as somebody's going to burn my house down, or that somebody's going to run me out of town if I talk about Jesus, but we all know that's not the case. We live with a particular amount of security. We have the security to know that I can talk freely about Jesus in most any circumstance I'm in, and I don't have to worry about my family disowning me. I don't have to worry about being killed. I don't have to worry about my kids being tortured or my home being burned to the ground. We view persecution largely, I would say, on what people are going to say about us. Isn't that funny? Now, I'm not saying verbal attacks are not persecution. Jesus says when they revile you, when they speak evil against you, he's referencing a verbal attack. Words matter. Words are personal, and words are memorable. And because words matter, that's why we're concerned on what people are going to say about us. But even more than that, I think our greatest fear is not what people are going to say about us. I think it's something much more severe. I think in our American culture, we're more worried about what people are going to think about us. We're worried about how they're going to view us. Not what they say, but what they think. And what they think, what they might think, what we think they might think, can often shut our mouths. You know, we talk about living in the United States, and we talk about it being a Christian nation. And this is not the time or the place to debate whether we are a Christian nation or not. There is no doubt that we were founded on Judeo-Christian values. But let me tell you something. I don't know exactly why. I can't put my finger exactly on why. the Christian church in America is not being persecuted. I want to say that it's because of the laws protecting our free speech. I want to say because it's ingrained in the DNA of our nation that we have a right to worship God as we see fit. But I can't help but think that there's another reason we're not being persecuted. And I think it's because we're not living a life that's persecutable. We're not taking stands. We're not bold in our proclamation of truth. We're not visible in our Christ-like love. I think both of those can play a part in our relationship, that the church largely is silent on issues. Now, that's not the case everywhere. I understand. I'm not trying to paint with a broad brush. But maybe we're not being persecuted as a church, not just because of the laws protecting, but because we may not be living a life that is visible and persecutable. These people were reviled and persecuted. Persecuted, the word Jesus is using, is a word that literally means to pursue. It's utilized when they describe someone hunting something. If you want a more perfect picture of this, go back to the book of Acts, chapter 8 and 9, and see what the Apostle Paul was doing to the believers as he was persecuting them, in his own words, persecuting the church of the living God. It means to intentionally harass, trouble, hurt, or kill, with a literal interpretation of hunting. It also highlights, notice these two Beatitudes together. Blessed are the peacemakers, the last two, and blessed are the persecuted. What Jesus is suggesting with these two words is that the believer, the peacemaker, even though he is seeking peace for you, and seeking peace for you and me, even though he is working on seeking peace and reconciliation between two, Jesus makes no mistake to remind the believer that he is going to have his own peace disrupted. His peace, because he is living out, he is the embodiment of these previous Beatitudes, because he is living so different and so contrary to the world around him. He is literally living as though he's walking upside down. His life is visible. His ministry is effective. His witness is clearly seen. And because his light burns so bright, there are forces and people that want to squelch it, because that light reveals darkness in them. And this person, this peacemaker, is going to have his own peace disrupted because of his faithfulness to Christ. What does it look like? It should be noted that this person is not being persecuted because of the clothes he wears. Because, let me just say this, I need to say this. You may be saying to yourself this morning, you're being persecuted at your job. Let me remind you, the persecution that Jesus is talking about is because of people falsely accusing them of his namesake. So this person is living a visible, faithful life to Christ. And people are lying and accusing this person and calling them names. You may be having conflict at work because people don't like you. It may not have anything to do with Christ. You may be struggling at work because you're not doing a good job. Just because people have a problem with you does not equal persecution. The persecution that Jesus is speaking of, that they utter and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. He says this is a result of me. This is a result of your loyalty, your steadfast love, your allegiance to me. Is the reason they're attacking you. And they're attacking you and saying things that are not true about you. Why are they blessed? I want you to see a passage. I'm going to ask you if you would throw that passage up on the screen for us, please. It's Philippians chapter 1. I want you to see it as we read together. Paul says, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Let me pause right there for a minute. Only let your manner be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Paul tells us what it means to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ. He introduces this concept and then he elaborates on what it means to live a life worthy of the gospel of Christ. So that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear that you are standing firm in one spirit. That's one way we can live worthy of the gospel of Christ, to stand firm together in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. We are not just standing firm. We are striving together for the sake of the gospel and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign of them, to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. So it's not just standing firm and it's not just striving, but it's about strength in the face of opposition. But notice verse 29. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in Him, but also suffer for His sake. What does it mean to live a life worthy of the gospel according to Paul's own words? It is to stand, to strive, to be strong, and to suffer. To be granted, it sounds as though it's been given to us. And it has. It is, according to the Gospels, a privilege. Why are we blessed? The better a person understands the relationship between makarios, happiness, and persecution, reveals their level of maturity in the progression of those Beatitudes. Because you see, many that are of not mature faith are going to wrestle with that tension and that conflict. Say, how can I be happy in the midst of being persecuted? How can these two coexist? The more you grow and are developing as a believer, that relationship begins to make sense. You begin to understand and appreciate this pattern that Christ has given us. But Jesus gives us 3 reasons why we're blessed. Not only because ours is the kingdom of heaven. We rejoice because our identity with Christ is visible. What the world needs now is revival. And that revival comes through Christians living a very visible witness of a transformed life through Jesus Christ. The second reason we're blessed is we're happy to share fellowship with the cloud of witnesses. What does Jesus say? Verse 12, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. When I am persecuted for Christ's sake, I have a greater appreciation for Abel. Have a greater appreciation for Joseph. Have a greater appreciation for Elijah, for Moses, for David. When I am persecuted for righteousness' sake, I can relate to Nehemiah. I can relate to Jeremiah. I can relate to most all of the prophets that were bold men to speak on God's behalf and to see the consequences. I'm able to relate to them, not the least of which is the greatest of all. When I am persecuted as a result of my faith, I'm able to relate to Christ. If He bore all of that for me, then it should be my honor, my high privilege, to bear the same for Him. My measure of persecution is nothing compared to the level of persecution that Christ received. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the persecuted. As we've gone through all 8 of these Beatitudes, I want to ask you a really simple question. What difference has Christ made in your life? Oftentimes it's so easy for us to walk an aisle, for us to raise our hand and pray a prayer. I'm not saying that those cannot be legitimate decisions. But I also know that there's a real tendency on our behalf to settle, to not grow and not develop, and not mature as a believer, and be content in Sunday morning attendance, maybe Sunday school partnership, and never really growing into a deeper life with Jesus. These blessings this true happiness that Jesus speaks of, is promised. It's as much a promise as anything else in Scripture. That when we are these people, we can expect a contentment, a satisfaction in life. Thanks for taking the time to listen to the podcast. I hope this message has helped you. If you made a decision for Christ or would like to speak with a staff member, call 417-624-4585 or email Carrie@FirstJoplin. Please subscribe and rate our podcast. Feel free to share it with your social media circle. We're glad you plugged into the teaching ministry of First Joplin, but would love to meet you in person if possible. Visit firstjoplin.org.